A lot of people seem to be taking melatonin
Yeah.
tablets. Is that healthy? Is that free from side effects?
So it's not entirely free of side effects, but it's generally a pretty well tolerated, safe drug as far as we know. There are some specific issues surrounding melatonin, but a question really would have to be, well, why are you taking that melatonin? Is there something that you can do to fix your sleep without relying on an exogenous substance, something that you've bought off the shelf or been prescribed?
Is there my hesitation and reservation with taking things like melatonin is always that I just assume that my body will become a little bit reliant on it.
Yeah. Well, I think I think whether you become physiologically, biologically reliant upon it or psychologically reliant upon it, it remains unanswered. But certainly, there are individuals who, for example, will say, well, as long as I know that I've got a bottle of melatonin or, the sleeping tablets in my bedside cabinet, I sleep fine. As soon as I know that I haven't got access to them, I don't sleep very well at all. And so that, I think, exhibits that this is almost like a psychological crutch. Knowing something that they've got next to their bed that they can reach for in order to achieve a good night's sleep is sometimes as important as the biological effects of taking that tablet.
I mean, that kind of leads to the non-medical techniques to improve our sleep. So you said typically with someone that comes to your sort of sleep center, instead of going straight to medication as the answer to their sleep issues, you would suggest and or try non-medical interventions.
Yes.
And you said that these work well.
Yes.
What are these non-medical interventions?
So the gold standard treatment now for insomnia is a treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Okay, so a lot of people have heard of CBT because they will have heard of it in the context of depression and treatment of depression or anxiety. Now, CBT for insomnia is not actually directly related to the CBT that's used for depression and anxiety. It borrows from the principles of CBT and applies them to sleep, and it serves two purposes. The first is to try and address some of those conscious psychological factors that are driving insomnia. And when I talk about conscious factors, I'm talking about things like the frustration or anxiety of the night ahead, of lying in bed at night feeling that you can't get off to sleep, and the frustration and anxiety that engenders, of having your partner snoring away in bed next to you whilst you're struggling to go off to sleep, of worrying about how you're going to be able to function the following day, or potentially even the long-term effects of your insomnia. So those are the conscious psychological factors, and CBTI aims to address those, but it also aims to restore normal, unconscious factors that give rise to good sleep. So if you've spent a great deal of time in bed at night awake, then those normal associations that good sleepers have between bed and sleep. So for a good sleeper, they will associate bed with being a place of comfort, with being a calming, relaxing place, a place that they associate with a good night's sleep. If your sleep has been disrupted for a period of time and you've spent long periods of time in bed awake, then that positive association between bed and sleep is replaced by a negative association. So you begin on an unconscious basis, Pavlovian conditioning it's called. You associate that bed environment with being awake, with being wired. And that's often what gives rise to this sensation of having lost the switch to be able to get off to sleep. In fact, some people with insomnia will say, well, look, if I'm sitting in front of the television and I'm sitting on the sofa and I'm not thinking about sleep at all, I'm not thinking about bed, I will often find that I've dozed off. And then I'll go upstairs, get into bed, and as soon as my head hits the pillow, ping, I'm wide awake and I suddenly feel wired. So that's very illustrative of that sort of unconscious association between bed and being awake rather than being asleep. And so CBTR aims to address that as well.
How does it do that?
So it uses a variety of different techniques. So it uses some standard sort of relaxation techniques to try and reduce the level of vigilance, of physiological, of mental arousal that you have when you get off to bed. But also it aims to utilize a variety of techniques to reprogram your brain to associate bed with sleep. So one of the ways in which you can do that is you can actually utilize your brain's own mechanisms that drive you to go off to sleep. So that's something called the homeostatic mechanism, which we'll all be very familiar with, but not in those terms. So the more you've been awake, the stronger the chemical drive for your brain to go off to sleep. So one of the features of CBTI is to compress your sleep or to restrict your sleep for a period of time. Essentially what that means is, well, if you are somebody with insomnia and you estimate, for example, that you're only sleeping a total of 6 hours a night in bed, but you're spending 8 hours a night in bed, then you, for a period of time, you say, well, look, I want you to get into bed at midnight, and whatever happens, I want you to get out of bed at 6 a.m. So to restrict the time in bed to 6 hours. So the first few nights, most people with insomnia will sleep really badly because they know that their alarm is going off at 6 and they know they have to get out of bed at 6. But after a little while, they become so sleep deprived that the brain starts forcing you to go off to sleep much more quickly. And over time, more and more of that 6 hours a night will be spent asleep in bed. And that's the first step in breaking that negative association between bed and wake and rebuilding a positive association between bed and sleep. I mean, at its extreme, there is a technique that was developed in Australia, which is called intensive sleep retraining. And in that technique, people who've got very bad insomnia are brought into a sleep laboratory, having been awake for the night before they come in. So they come in the evening, having been awake for now probably 36 hours. Every half an hour, they're given the opportunity to drop off to sleep. They have some wires on their heads, their brain waves are being tracked, but as soon as they've been asleep for 3 minutes, based on their brain waves, they're woken up again. And that happens every half hour for 25 hours. So over the course of that 25-hour period, they have 50 opportunities to nap. Now, for most people with insomnia, having been awake the previous 36 hours, they will still not be able to get off to sleep for the first few naps. But as they get more and more sleep deprived, every time they're given the opportunity to drop off to sleep, they will start falling asleep more quickly. And at the end of that 50 naps, they will be dropping off to sleep very quickly as soon as the lights go off. And actually, the evidence suggests that that's a very good short-term treatment for chronic insomnia. And in some individuals, it works extremely well in reassociating your head hitting the pillow with drifting off to sleep. I wouldn't suggest it for most people because it's basically a form of torture, but I think it illustrates the power of trying to get people into a more sleep-deprived state if they've got insomnia.
It's interesting because much of what you've said makes me think that we all have our own sleep identity. And when I say sleep identity, I mean a story we tell ourselves about our relationship with sleep. And it makes me think that our sleep identity is much more powerful than I think we think. Because if you speak to anybody in this room, upstairs, wherever, and you say, what do you like at sleeping? They will deliver their sleep identity. They'll say, I'm a bad sleeper. And I wonder how much of that is self-fulfilling. Because I think I've always told myself that I'm a good sleeper, and therefore I find sleep easy. And I've got friends who will say, oh, I'm a really bad sleeper. And I'm wondering how much that's impacting their ability to sleep, and or if they even know objectively if they are actually a good or bad sleeper. It's just this identity we've embodied. Do you see that a lot? Do you see that how someone's sleep identity kind of determines how they actually sleep?
I think all of that is true, undoubtedly. And I think this comes back to the earlier bit of our conversation about sleep trackers, because obviously sleep trackers reinforce that sleep identity, whether they are 100% accurate or not. And so, yes, that sort of sleep identity would undoubtedly influence both those conscious and unconscious factors that give rise to sleep. You know, if you're a good sleeper and you've always been a good sleeper, you don't worry about any of these things. You probably don't even worry about any aspects of sleep hygiene. You'll quite happily, like you, watch a horror movie in bed before you drift off to sleep. But for those individuals who are not, yes, absolutely, that the way that you view sleep and your relationship with sleep is of fundamental importance. It is, again, coming back to genes, we know that there are undoubtedly genetic factors that influence whether or not you're likely to develop insomnia. So again, as with all aspects of sleep, it's that combination of genetics environment. And when I talk about environment, I'm also talking about your own psychological internal environment.
The other thing I was thinking, we talked about sleep apnea earlier on, but it seems that a lot of people believe they have a deviated septum. Is it called deviated septum?
Septum, yeah.
Septum.
Yeah.
Septum. I've heard some people say that that's the reason that they can't sleep, and they've gone off to get surgery to kind of correct the deviated septum.
Mm.
What's your thoughts on that? Is that true? Because I wonder, I'm like, we can't all be being born broken with these deviated septums or whatever.
I think it's normal for us to have some asymmetry in our noses. And a lot of people have a deviated septum as a result of having broken their nose, for example. You know, I'm a little bit suspicious about, you know, operations for that kind of thing, unless there are very clear abnormalities that might be responsible for sleeping poorly. So one of the major issues, for example, in sleep apnea is sleep apnea, the obstruction is in the throat, it's not in the nose. Mm-hmm. And so issues with nasal congestion or difficulty breathing through the nose do not directly cause obstructive sleep apnea. What they can do in some individuals is they can encourage people to breathe through their mouth and breathe with their mouths open, which alters the position of the jaw and can create a bit more narrowing in the back of the throat. So for some individuals who have very prominent nasal congestion at night and who have evidence of sleep apnea, sorting out their nasal congestion and correcting a deviated septum may be one way of doing that. There is undoubtedly a rationale for sorting that out. I think that there are probably quite a few individuals who are having unnecessary operations.
Makes sense. So we've got the cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia as one cure. We've got that extreme torture therapy that they did in Australia.
Yeah.
We've got melatonin, magnesium. People have mentioned magnesium.
Yeah, so anecdotally, magnesium can help some individuals. And, you know, anecdotally also magnesium is a very good treatment, as testified to by some of my patients, for conditions like restless leg syndrome.
What's that?
Restless leg syndrome is this sort of neurological disorder whereby people, and it's often associated with things like pregnancy or low iron levels, but it's under genetic control as well. People experience a number of different things. So the first thing is that they get an urge to move at night. And it's typically at night rather than during the day, often associated with unpleasant sensations, that if they try and keep still, that sensation builds and builds and builds until they have to move. That if they do move, they get some transient relief, and it's often associated with kicking at night in your sleep. It's very common in pregnancy, very common in people who are anemic, and in people who've got problems with their kidneys, but it's common in the general population as well. And so for people with restless leg syndrome, magnesium does sometimes help significantly.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.